Thank you very much. This is not an April Fool's joke. I'm not Jenica Hunsinger. Jenica is my colleague at Medway Community Forest Co-op. She wasn't able to be here today, so I'm somewhat of a last-minute substitution for Jenica on this. And I'll do my best to do it justice. Certainly, if you have any questions that I can't answer, I'd encourage you to reach out to Jenica. I'm going to tell you about the Nova Scotia Working Woodlands Trust. This is an organization that's been in development for about 2 years now. The goal is to provide a new tool to landowners to help them conserve their forest, protect their stewardship legacy, and connect them to carbon markets. Nope. There we go. So the Nova Scotia Working Woodlands Trust was sort of the brainchild or the child of the Medway Community Forest Co-op. NCFC is Nova Scotia's first community forest. We're a membership-based, community-led, for-profit social enterprise based up in the Caledonia area. Our license area, about 15,000 hectares, is in Annapolis County, around Ketchimakujik National Park and the Medway Rivers, where the east and west branch come together. We manage that land on a multiple value, ecosystem-based management approach. And at MCFC, there's always been an intention to work and try to serve the private landowner community, and the Working Woodlands Trust began as a conversation hosted with MCFC, a recognition of the need out there on the private landowner landscape, so to speak, and then the development of the project has come to fruition here. The team at the Working Woodlands Trust is comprised of representatives of private landowner stewardship organizations and private landowners from all across Nova Scotia. So myself and Jenica are kind of playing the staff role. We have our executive and different directors, and the goal is to try to work with organizations and individuals from across Nova Scotia as we've tried to develop this initiative. One of the things that we're really focused on and working towards is this notion of integrating First Nation values into the work that we're doing at the Land Trust. As a settler-based organization, we acknowledge that the conservation movement in Canada has benefited largely from the appropriation of Indigenous lands, and our colonial systems have created barriers for Indigenous peoples to access those lands. And so as a result of those acknowledgements, we are committing to educate ourselves and the landowners that we work with and listen to Indigenous partners, integrate traditional use on our easement properties, and two-eyed seeing into our management approaches. We want to create opportunities to donate lands to Indigenous communities, as well as promote open access on land trust properties, and build relationships, alleviate boundaries, and continue to have hard conversations. Another thing I'm asking you, or another concept we're trying to introduce or promote, is this notion of stewardship and land stewards as opposed to land ownership. And so we recognize the concept of private ownership was unfamiliar to the First Nations peoples of Nova Scotia, and we're trying to use the expression woodland stewardship to acknowledge that private lands may not have ever been legally ceded or sold to settlers. We're asking landowners to consider their relationship with private land ownership as a concept, to reconsider that concept, and instead vow to act as a steward of the forest, managing it as a resource for future generations. Oh, I just went too ahead. I'm trying to look at two things at once here, so. Okay. So why do we need a land trust? Why be building out this Working Woodlands Trust? So as land stewards age, we are hearing a lot of concerns and comments around generational transfer of their properties. A number of scenarios have occurred in this. So maybe the kids have moved away to the city, they don't have an interest in inheriting the land. A number of scenarios which result in forestry practices, like displaced successors or capital gains tax, the new owners becoming an economic pinch, and all of these things are scenarios that potentially lead to liquidation harvests or unsustainable forest practices. So creating a land trust that can offer easements for landowners is a way to protect forest health and uphold the stewardship legacies of landowners over time into the future. So there are a number of scenarios that we see playing out. So liquidation, harvesting, conversion to agricultural lands, subdivisions. These are all the types of activities that would become prohibited on properties that have these working forest easements attached to them. And so our vision is this notion of maintaining forest cover and growing quality forest products that help sustain income over time instead of leading to liquidation of the lands. We want to support landscape connectivity in Nova Scotia. Private land is such an important part of the landscape in Nova Scotia because so much of Nova Scotia is privately held. And promote ecological forestry through climate adaptive silviculture and ecological forestry practices. And so the idea is that we would support landowners by upholding their stewardship legacy, so the easement protects the management that's happened and creates a pathway for that management to continue into the future. We would allow sustainable harvest of timber. It provides access to carbon markets, which is really important in terms of a mechanism to allow landowners to tap into that. We can integrate a current woodland steward's values into the long-term stewardship of that property, and as that property changes hands, the Working Woodland Trust is in place to provide support for the new owners of the property. So the idea is that we would complement existing traditional conservation-focused land trusts. So there are a number of land trusts that exist in Nova Scotia right now, the Nova Scotia Nature Trust and the Nature Conservancy of Canada. Both of those are geared towards conservation of the land, and they don't allow for continued forest management and opportunities to access timber markets and things like that. It's strictly a conservation focus. We would hold easements under the Community Easements Act. So that Community Easement Act allows for a working forest conservation easement, which would be a new opportunity for landowners in the province. The land trust would provide the stewardship and a monitoring program to ensure that the owners of the properties are maintaining the covenants of the easement as it's laid out. We envision that the land trust could potentially own lands either through acquisition or donation to the land trust itself. So what is a working forest easement? So a community easement or a working easement is a legally binding document between an eligible body, such as the land trust, and a landowner through the Community Easement Act. It outlines restrictions and allowances on the land for use of that. So things like future property development, natural resource extraction, and then a mechanism for ongoing stewardship and monitoring. Those easements are tied to the deed, so they stay with the property as it changes hands over time. And one thing we want to kind of clarify is we're not intending to provide management services to the landowners themselves. That's why we're working with these regional partners, forest stewardship partners, that are providing those services on behalf of the landowners. So the Working Woodlands Trust would really be the body that would oversee the easements and the monitoring over time. So this is a map just showing those management partners that we work with, some of whom are here today, like the Western Woodlot Services Co-op, North Nova Forestry Co-op. We've got a good spread across the property, or across the province, of organizations who are working directly with landowners and helping them steward their properties. So as part of the easement, one of the things is there's agreed practices, and the first step in that is the land zoning. So you would look at your property and decide which areas are going to be part of your forestry zone, where the active forest management would take place. You would have a conservation zone, which would be sort of forever wild, no touch, basically a protected area within your property. I've worked with private landowners for many years across Nova Scotia. Almost every family forest owner I've ever worked with has one of these sort of de facto protected areas on their property. And the benefit of this is that we can, it was mentioned, the protected areas target. We see the land trust as a vehicle to be able to have those conservation zones contribute towards the conservation targets that the province has set for Nova Scotia. And then would allow for things like have a recreational off-grid zone, but like your house property, any current agricultural lands, those would not be part of your working forest easement. They'd be taken out of the easement at this kind of initial zoning phase. So within the easement and the agreed practices, there's this notion of that there's permitted, restricted, and prohibited, permitted, restricted, and prohibited activities. So permitted activities are allowed anytime. Things like non-timber forest product gathering, walking on your woodlot, motorized vehicle use, those kind of things are A-OK under the easement. Non-commercial foraging. You'd have restricted activities. Now these are allowed, but they would happen under the framework set out in the easement, and they would have to happen with certain 60-day notice to the land trust. You would let the land trust know, hey, we're planning a timber harvest on our land. This is the stand that we're going to do it in. It's gives certainty that it aligns with the management plan for the property. And then there'd be prohibited activities. So this would be property subdivision, liquidation or unsustainable forestry practices, or building a new home property like a residence wouldn't be allowed under that. In the conservation zone, you would only have the permitted activities, so those low impact or no impact activities, or approved restoration projects as well. So what is agreed? What is an agreed or permitted use in terms of the forest management? And what we want to do is align the practices on private land with the goals of ecological forestry. So any activities that would consider climate adaptivity, mimic natural disturbances while maintaining biodiversity features and ecological functions. It also would preserve those forever wild areas delineated as at the time of establishing the easement. And then it would not allow for, as I mentioned, those unsustainable, ecologically inappropriate practices like large-scale clear cutting, overstory removal, or the removal of permanent retention features within an ecological harvest approach. So our criteria that we're considering now for landowners to potentially be a part of this program, we're hoping to have 50 forested acres. The bigger the better, just from a kind of administration or management perspective, with a goal of at least 50% in a mature or over 40 years of age at least. Managed or unmanaged state. One requirement would be the establishment of a FSC certified management plan. Some of the nice to haves, being part of a forested contiguous landscape, opportunities to provide public access, and presence of things like special wildlife features. So a big part of this is how do you pay for it? Long-term monitoring and establishing these easements is expensive, and there's a cost that it is dependent on the size of the property and the risk of the infraction. So things like annual monitoring costs, liability costs, legal defense in the event of an infraction. This can run anywhere from $70 to $150 an acre as sort of a one-time cost to be able to protect that land over time. And so our solution that I think is unique and innovative about the land trust is that we would use carbon credits and carbon offsetting to finance the easement. And the great thing about this is that there'd actually be our projections are that there'd be revenue left over for the landowner as well. So by becoming a member of the Working Woodlands Trust, having this easement on your property, you protect your forest stewardship over time, but it also gives you access to carbon markets, which you otherwise wouldn't be able to. And the credits will finance the cost of the endowment as well as provide a payment to the landowner over time. So we would establish a carbon agreement, which is an agreement between the land trust and the developer, and it's also an agreement between the land trust and the landowner. Goal is to have 10,000 acres in the initial pool. We could add to that for up to 2 years, and we'll be working under the improved forest management protocol. We would secure them in perpetuity and provide annual monitoring and following up on if there were any infractions. So this is just an example of what some of that cost breakdown, just purely sort of a forecast of what we anticipate here. So if you had a property with on a 200-acre woodlot with a carbon value of $60,000 to $80,000, there's about 30% of that would go into establishing the endowment to be able to monitor that, establish and monitor that easement over time. There's another 20% that is the administrative and insurance costs associated with maintaining that easement, and then some funding set aside for ongoing inventory. The properties need to be visited every year to monitor the carbon that's there, as well as to monitor that the practices are aligned with the easement. And that leaves about 40% left over for the landowner to I see I'm out of time here, so I'm going to try and... Oh, I have 3 minutes. Okay, great. So what we're trying to, I guess one of the things I think in entering into this easement, you are binding yourself and subsequent owners to harvesting practices that may result in less of a financial gain, in particular over the short term. Surprise, surprise, clear cutting your woodlot is the best way to make the most money off the timber. But by foregoing that option, you're able to tap into these carbon markets, which provides that other incentive over time. And as I mentioned, we talked about the protected areas target. So other effective area-based conservation measures is a concept that's being developed in cooperation with this protected areas target. So the idea is things other than strict legal protection that provide a protection framework for conservation value over time. And the conservation zones designated under the working forest easements, we feel, and it still remains to be seen, but there's a strong case to be made that conservation zone that you establish in an easement, which is a legally binding document, would give the province the certainty to be able to count those lands towards the protected areas target. I think on Crown land all too often you see the zero-sum game of different interests competing for a bigger slice of the pie. So how much of Crown land do we designate towards timber or resource extraction? How much do we designate towards a conservation footprint? Everybody's arguing for a bigger piece of the same pie, and these OECMs and the Working Woodlands Trust is an opportunity to grow that pie. And in particular with using the carbon funding is that there are limits to how much land can be protected through the conservation organizations, again, because of the cost of easements. So it requires philanthropy money to pay for it, or for landowners to donate their land directly to the Nature Trust or the Nature Conservancy. And so this vehicle, the Land Trust, is a vehicle to be able to use carbon offsetting to really greatly grow the amount of land that is protected under working forest easements through those conservation zones. MCSC is also on the cusp of launching a hemlock woolly adelga treatment. James had mentioned earlier, our hemlocks are in trouble. We have an invasive pest that's already wreaking havoc on hemlocks in Nova Scotia. Right now, there's funding. We've been hired under some funding through the Nature Smart Climate Solutions Fund, and similar to the protected areas target, the reporting on the fundings requires some legal protection. The Federal Environment Department doesn't want to pay for trees to be treated against HWA only to have them harvested. So there needs to be a protection in place, and our conservation zones, again, are an opportunity for that. As well as the federal 2 Billion Trees program that's coming out here shortly. Bit of a rush to get to the end there, but yeah, thank you very much.